Well, yeah, I'm the professor of environmental history at the Royal Institute of Technology, where I'm also involved in the KTH Environmental Humanities Laboratory. Well, the Anthropocene is a very interesting new concept. I think it's got the advantages of focusing really on human impacts on nature and on the planet, and as such, it's very welcome. Still, it's also sort of a blanket, very broad brush concept that tends to, I mean, there is a certain concern among some of us that the human diversity is being put at the background. It's really very important to bring culture and diversity and societies and human individuals into that picture. Well, my message here was that the humanities need to play a role here. Culture, societies, values, religion, knowledge, many of those things will actually steer the future of the Anthropocene, and it needs to be taken fully into account.
Thanks very much indeed for being invited here. It's not my first trip to Australia, but every trip is cherished, I could say. I've been here a number of hours, so I feel I've been here almost forever. I will speak on something that you can see on the screen here. I shouldn't say much about the title. You could read the abstract, but I take my cue from the very important article by Arne Næss, Norwegian philosopher, who as the ecology was rising as a, not as a discipline because it was much older, but as a worldview, so to speak. He made the cautioning remark in the early 70s that maybe there could be various ways of doing this. We could have a shallow thinking here, we could have a not so profound approach, and we could really transform things. And I'm an advocate here today. I'm not going to be terribly sort of say, my words shouldn't be too big though, but you can see me as an advocate for a transformation of the humanities, which I think is very timely. I would start by showing the overview of the talk. And as you can see, I am quite ambitious. We'll see how far this reaches. And I shouldn't spend much more on the overview. But while you watch that, I'd like to actually start us off with a story that is recent for me, sort of an anecdote, that thing that happened recently. I was asked by the Swedish Research Council. They open websites now. They want engaged researchers. They asked me to provide an op-ed kind of thing, and it was going to be about numbers, because I've been working lots of recently on ecosystem services and various problems of simplification. There's a major meeting at Cornell about these themes recently, and I can provide something on that. But numbers are quite boring sometimes, so I had a problem writing that. But then I read in the New York Times about the third, I think, in a series of very long articles by the same journalist and photographer about a young girl by the name of Dasani, is her name, she's named for the mineral water. Her mother was a drug addict like her father, and there are 7 siblings. And this was about her in this particular place where they take families like that, and she could go to school and all of that. And it seemed to me, just reading this, and I could hardly say it to you as you can hear me, my voice is not functioning really. It was very moving. It is extremely moving. It's on the web. You can read about it. So I used that particular episode of social life to somehow juxtapose the numbers with the human experience. And that became, overnight, I should say, the most commented, the most cited, the most discussed item they'd ever had on this particular webpage. And many people came out and told me I'd done sort of very important work in saying that, although I thought it was pretty obvious, and to point to the limits of certain approaches when it comes to changing things really. And other people came out from their tribes, to use this very good word, I think, and because they felt somehow threatened. They were the providers of the numbers, and I wasn't actually having anything against them. I think numbers are very good for the most part. They are terribly necessary. But there was something uncomfortable in just saying that there is a tension here, and that there are certainly, I would like to call it political dimensions that run quite deep in this discussion, and I'll take this as a point of departure as I move along. So there are certain elements of conventional wisdom about the humanities, and here are some. Basically, you can sum up this slide by saying it isn't very much use, actually. You will have heard many more arguments than these. They are marginal. They can't provide very much. They only say obvious things, and if they maybe say it beautifully sometimes. And also, one important criticism, last point, there is a lot of self-imposed irrelevance by being overly theoretical and philosophical and so on. This is very much an understanding that we have been living with and sometimes producing ourselves as humanists. I think perceptions have been changing for a number of reasons for some time, and that has to do, look at these points, with major changes going on. Religion, more persistent than we thought. Climate change is not just about geophysics, about humans as drivers, as we heard earlier. It's lots of things going on, the coupling of various crises that many of us are thinking a lot about. And it's somehow more and more increasingly impossible to say that, well, we don't need to focus also on the value systems, the religions, the literature, the arts. But still, it is not very clear what to do with all this insight that is somehow coming along. And also, of course, predictions, numbers in those predictions can only say so much, and if we follow the history of predictions, it is not a very comforting story. Also, there is a demand being voiced from the science community, if I may say so. Here is just one example to do with the new initiative, Future Earth, the repackaging of the big global programs into new ambitions. There is some things in Europe also with the H2020, Horizon 2020 program. Big discussion there about the role of humanities and social sciences. And there is seemingly some sort of demand that maybe here the humanities and the social sciences should play a more major role. And I assume something similar is going on in Australia, because it seems to be going on everywhere. But then how is this going to happen, and at what cost, and so forth? And of course, this could have been a talk that talked about the costs, the policies, and all that. I won't do that today. I'm perfectly prepared in the middle of the night. Just wake me up and I can do that. But today I'm actually aiming for something, I think, slightly more interesting, although that is, of course, also very, very crucial. And let me start then by framing this whole thing of the environment, slightly repeating a little bit of what, in other words, perhaps what Libby just said. We are, after all, writing books together, as you heard. And I have a slightly nuance difference here, maybe also. This was a fine thing we heard from Graham Wynne, a Canadian colleague, when he commented on a session we had in Munich some months ago about our book. And this guy, John Crosby, whoever that might be, who said this funny thing in 1972, damn the environment, a year ago, no one had heard of it. Why couldn't we just go on fishing as we did now? And that is, I think it speaks to something very, very historically. This is important. The environment has a phenomenal career as a concept, and these are some of the forms. We should be quite interested in how it became so successful, and here are some of the reasons. And I think one important concept here is the scaling, how the environment has been useful in saying very different things, actually. And these points, they really bring the story that the environment itself as a concept has meant totally different thing in a way. It started being a local influence on the human psyche. Herbert Spencer articulated such ideas a long time ago. Then it became something that determined, climate not the least, the future of man. Societies, civilizations, some famous names there from the geographers, the geosciences, and so forth. And then plants, animals, the sort of middle range ecological story that I think most of us are familiar with. And only very late came this very important turning point when it turned into something with its own properties, the environment, which actually, where the direction had changed, so the humans were impacting. And in that regard, maybe my conclusion would be that environment is really a predecessor of the Anthropocene emphasizing even more that the arrows are going from the humans to the earth, to the environment. And here are some of the visuals, just to get you to see them, from Vogt's book that was mentioned. He was very pedagogical, to say the least, to convince his audience. It was a bestseller, fantastic, millions of copies actually. And similar ideas were out there, visuals of peak oil, peak energy, whatever. It's very old indeed. And when you do study the 50s in this respect, you find that much of the discussions we have today, they are there already then, more or less, with less detail and so on. And here is actually the Princeton place that we talked about. And sometimes they used metaphors from the current, well, in this case, an atomic bomb. And we are quite interested in the kinds of expertise. If you can read the white there, you can see this is George Borgstrom, the population prophet, and his style of expertise, very omnipotent, you could say, not being in doubt about anything, and have proven wrong on most things. And another one who has been proven right, though, very much, the meteorologist, another Swede, it happened to be actually Carl Gustav Rossby, who had his career in the United States, who links this to the military sphere very much. Here is his student, Bert Bolin, in his younger days, sitting, I should say. And he links this also again to lots of, it's an interesting science story how this environmental knowledge is being built. And it's being built in many, many dimensions. Here is after him being, taking his role as the IPCC chair, and still very much a question of authority and expertise being somehow in congruence still, I should say. And here is maybe a not so deeply rooted scientist who exposes ideas on a different level, but very much understanding of the science. But here is a guy who has become sort of the incarnation of a more problematic side of this, when the details, the numbers don't really follow exactly the experimental or science schemes. This is an interesting story to unpack in and of itself. I don't have time to do that today, but I think it's important to carry it with us and to realize that this is a multidimensional phenomenon. Now, that was backdrop. Let's turn to the emerging humanities, and I will not speak of all the humanities, of course. I'm going to focus on a few things that are appearing as I see them now, which are important to our discussions here these days, I think. This is a picture actually borrowed from a program undertaken in Norway right now by linguists and scholars in languages and literature. And they look at statements of what people think and say, and the kind of rhetoric that is used in this case by climate deniers. They call it pollution, we call it life. And it's hard to protest such a statement, particularly with this image. So this is a humanities take on an issue, and we can immediately, the numbers just bang into the background, and we say, oh, this is important, actually. So why do we ridicule this in Australia? Well, we know why. So the humanities turn, I think, is prompted by a number of paradigmatic crises. And here is just a few, but some major ones. The crisis of ecological modernization, the 90s concept that Morten Heyer and other esteemed colleagues, I must tell you, provided. I was very much an avid believer in this. I'm not anymore. I think it didn't work as we hoped it would. But it's still out there live and kicking and very popular among certain politicians and so on. It's a crisis of expertise. We saw Pachauri recently as an incarnation of that. It's a crisis of numbers for reasons I will only have to be able to develop in the Q&A. It's also a crisis of the concept of globalization and boundless globalization. All these are facts. They are happening, but we may not be as fond of them as we used to. We have seen some of the drawbacks. And we also have now quite some new knowledge about why we should distrust some of this. Many of you have probably read Theodore Porter's work in the 90s on how numbers are being used to establish authority and to thus put in a certain element of distance to this. But fewer have read Christine Astal's work, which I expect to be very important in the future when it's becoming increasingly translated, about limits and boundaries and the kind of work these things do when you put it into practice. I couldn't go into detail for time reasons of her work, but it's in a nutshell, it is she's followed in sharp detail the post-Second World War story in Norway of a number of imposed environmental limitations and how they've actually served the purpose of exactly the contrary that they were meant to be for. They were meant to bring down pollution, but they actually opened up ultimately possibilities to pollute even more. It may sound paradoxical. And of course, the Norwegians have been extremely successful when it comes to CO2. Talking about rhetoric, their former prime minister said something like this: the key of the matter is not to keep the carbon in the ground. The key of the matter is to not let it go out into the air. Hypocrisy rules. New insights on knowledge are coming up in the new humanities. These are just a few examples. Very important work that questions the kind of boundaries we used to draw between politics and science. Andy Sörlin of SPRU in the UK talks about responsible directionality. You couldn't just say innovation and say everything is good as long as it's innovation and growth. It's a matter of where it goes and what might be the effects for the environment and the atmosphere. Roger Pielke's work on The Honest Broker belongs in this category. Susan Owens has done important work on what we might want to call situational absorption. When precisely do politics take up certain concepts? And of course, Sheila Jasanoff, who in a string of books over a decade or so has been work to erode the divide between science and politics and provide new ways of giving advice and so on. This is happening. This is changing the way we relate science and politics and knowledge and how we negotiate these things, and they are coming from the humanities. Without these insights, much of the talk we are doing wouldn't be possible to utter. There are new insights on political theory. And in my slightly optimistic view, I'm that kind of person, I would like to see right now a rise again of the political to replace a quite long darkness of the post-political that Swingedo and others coined some time ago. And you can, if you take on those glasses, identify a number of interesting sources in these discussions. French philosophers, as always, Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, talking about the social, the aesthetic that we heard about also in the previous sessions. The Johns Hopkins political theorist William Connolly and his work on becoming. One of his books recently is entitled The World of Becoming, and he talks about how we are in a creative collective mode, whereas in his view, the enemy, the neoliberal frame, is really a very static view of the market as an ahistoric almost component, and the state as an equally ahistoric component. These are actually things that we can mold and change. Fragility, in the title of his most recent book last year, about the fragility of things, really, the kind of world we live in, which is not yet politicized. The kind of elements that we see, the kind of things we heard about in the previous session, are not yet fully politicized. And they will not be unless we can provide a discussion and a climate of discussing this as politics too. Melissa Lane at Princeton and her work on the eco-ethics of the ancients, how you can actually go back to the old sources and pick up important concepts. Politeia was, of course, Plato's concept, something different from when you hear the state or the republic. But actually, politeia was the original concept. And you can go on and find more insights from political theory that provide us with food for thought, really. New insights on history, quite a few of them. Many of you are familiar with the second point there, the number of historical works starting in the 80s with Alfred Crosby's work on global exchanges of species and diseases and so on, and many others, even present in the room, and certainly often from Australia, actually. There seems to be a global view from here. But look at the first point. Stuart Eldon, the very classically trained geographer, goes deeply into the political concepts and writes a new narrative, I would say, in my reading of him at least. The old one we had was that people only would let go of power to any central authority with some very, very deep caution. That we teach pupils at school about this, how the state of nature was so dangerous and so on, and tyranny was always lurking. But in his view, politics, the polis, is really something that follows human societies in their finest hour, and how we couldn't live without it, and how we are actually gathering together to solve problems, not by coming up with simplified numbers necessarily, although they can assist us, but precisely because we need to articulate values. Without these articulation of values, without the contestation of values, this wouldn't be possible. We also have new narratives of the planetary scale. We'll hear more about that probably in a minute. The least known, I suppose, by my references there is Joe Masco at Chicago, and his work on what he calls terraforming planet Earth, which I will come back to towards the end of my talk. There are new narratives of hope, and some not so new, that we can connect to. The last point is Ernst Bloch's 1940s and 50s work, so extremely important, linked to politics, about the anticipation and identity of humans generally, and of societies too, that we can imagine ourselves hoping to become something that we were not, and maybe aspire to our noblest ambitions and views of ourselves. And the kind of empirical work we do now, they come up with results that seem to question the very notion of solutions, that we could find ready-made solutions that we put into political practice. If we look back at the major transformations that have actually occurred in the last century or so, think of democracy on a broad scale, think about industrial production systems, think about the consumer society revolution. Some of these have bad consequences, but there are still major social changes. Think about public health. Think about human and social rights, welfare societies. These are not very old and ancient phenomena, they are recent. They happened not because they installed a new Future Earth program or a science-based approach, but it happened as broad sweeping change in societies. They were multi-purpose, multi-acted, they were creative, they were normative, they were life-transforming, they were life-enhancing, they were possible to mobilize people around with particular narratives that were at their center. So things are going on. We are not at loss, so to speak. We are doing a lot of work that is not yet fully coalesced into new understandings. That is something that I think is part of the work that needs to be done. So if this, what I've said so far, is largely an is kind of thing, we might want to move to ought. What should we actually do? And I think the humanities largely are at a formative moment right now. Neglect is dangerous. We probably need to do something really. And as I said before, the expectations are growing. What we do now will have consequences for probably a long time. I don't think there will be a single silver bullet. Rather, the historical evidence shows us that this is broader, sweeping changes with much is very unpredictable, unforeseeable. And maybe also one should avoid some short-term instrumentalist research. At least humanists are commonly very reluctant to take that on. But then again, what then is the offer that can be made? I think very importantly, we need to articulate relevance and in order to halt marginalization and change. And I can here point to a number of recent reports. For example, the one from the Carnegie Foundation in the US, Rethinking Undergraduate Business Education, which showed a sort of a counterintuitive result, namely the fact that business students, MBAs that had also studied humanities were clearly the most successful and also earned most money and things like that. That was disturbing news to many and of course cherished by others. The AAAS published, the American Academy of Sciences, Advancement of Sciences, they published this report, The Heart of the Matter, last year. You could say many things about that. It was probably not very deep thinking, but it was a sign that the crisis in the United States needs also the humanities to be halted. In Europe, the European Science Foundation had this rescue program. I was part of it myself a little bit, and also gave a report about a year ago, maybe 2 now, with major proposals. You could say that these and many other more national indications point towards a new transformative Anthropocene humanities taking shape, and we are bound to contribute more to that. And we should look, of course, not to change the humanities in the way that we abandon things we do well. The old methods and pathways should still be there. But there are some items, again, that I don't spend time on now: how to rethink professional schools to install humanities there, how to build new curricula, faculty structures, integrative approaches. And I realized that for time reasons, I will not be able to give my favorite example, which is our own division, actually, where we try to sort of put these things into practice, and it goes very well. So let's move on. We are also, I think, importantly, in the need to look for more relations to the outside world. It is a true criticism of the humanities that their relations have been too few and maybe too narrow. And that work is also, I think, happening in many places, to embed scholars in practical work situations, in institutions, organizations, across society in ways that other fields have developed much more efficiently for a longer period of time. So there are many methods and ways to do this. And I say this now very quickly and without much detail and nuance, not because I think it is unimportant, but it is very important. But it is something that that we also need to articulate over time to come. We need also to spend a minute thinking about what the humanities did contribute before to the understanding of the environment. We have all said here this morning that this was very much an invention of the scientists and the sciences. But if you go back, and I'm currently actually doing work on this, if you go back and try to really look for humanists and social scientists, they are there too. Lucien Febvre's iconic text from 1922, for example, where, and actually I have a quote here, he says something here with a lovely little sentence: "Between man and his natural environment, ideas are always creeping in," he says. And also he talks about well, he actually is already back in the early 1920s, he makes this arrow shift. I would say before most of the scientists had even started thinking about that. He's so demonstrably alien to any kind of determinism that he is a possibilist, as they called it. And he would say, so it is us humans that actually change the world. He was an Anthropocene thinker in 1922, and I think that's worth pointing out, and he was an historian. So to add to your list, Jan. And if you go back into national stories, like in Sweden, we have a number of artists, thinkers, and architects that really do contribute if you are able to read the fine print. Elin Wägner being a feminist already back in the 30s and early 40s, who published a number of books that we would today frame as anthropocenic, and so on. And I think the disciplinary stories from the 70s onwards we know very well since before. Now, I will have to skip this little side story of how a professional school in Sweden is rebuilding itself, and actually having provided industrial competencies for a long time, should now ask a question to herself: what about the Anthropocene? What sort of knowledge shall we provide for the coming century? And then the way our department has particularly reshaped itself almost totally in 20-25 years to serve these kinds of purposes. And you can only barely see the keywords here as I move on to the what I think is actually the most important and 4-minute part of my talk, which is about some key concepts here that we need to think carefully about. And I've chosen just a handful. The first is justice. And those of you who were present last night heard at the opening event up at the University of Sydney heard some things about environmental justice, and I think even more could be said about that. And in the context of the Anthropocene, I think again we need to ask some tough questions about the kind of language we're using here. It's very important these days to talk about guardrails, about planetary boundaries. I was actually a co-author of the Planetary Boundaries article in Nature some years ago, and so much has happened in those 4 or 5 years since then. My thinking has, if not changed totally, so at least moved a bit forward. And I think we see now also the problems with that actually it tends to turn the humanity at large in a role as providing these environmental impacts, whereas of course it isn't true. It is very diverse, as was already said, I think, by Libby. We have paid too little attention to distribution, and to, if we again take this other research line I'm involved in with ecosystem services, it favors purchasing power at the cost of social movements and politics. And it is as if these lines of work have big problems taking on board what is absolutely necessary if we are to understand how things are going to change in society. So I think the whole discourse of justice is absolutely crucial here if we want to make some progress. And power seems to be a concept also largely lacking from Anthropocene discourse. Interestingly also, I think we are in the Anthropocene era facing some major changes in very basic notions of time and temporalities. Fernand Braudel was, of course, the arch saint of historiography for a long time through his concept of la longue durée. And la longue durée, according to Braudel, and again I will have a quote here, well, he said like this: "For centuries, man has been a prisoner of climate, of vegetation, of the animal population, of a particular agriculture, of a whole slowly established balance from which he cannot escape without the risk of everything being upset." Now, that was probably the kind of message that John referred to when he talked about his undergraduate time, because this is a worldview that is so recent, but certainly not true. It is incompatible with the concept of Anthropocene. And we are now doing work. We're going to have a session about this in San Francisco in a couple of weeks at the American Society for Environmental History, about the current situation, which seems to be a nature on speed, a nature that sort of goes much faster than Braudel ever thought. What does that mean to history? In what ways do geoscientists, for example, reshuffle the conditions of writing history? What is happening with the binaries between history and future? As you very well refer to, that historians are very uncomfortable with the future. But I think today we are more and more historians that deal, if not comfortably, so at least we feel we should break that binary. Maybe Malthusians are coming back into the limelight again with the possibilism under restraint that the Anthropocene seems to call for, and so on. So many things are happening at fundamental categories that we conceive of time and society and how they move forward. And finally, let me spend a minute or two of my overtime here. I have a clock here that I can see exactly by the second how much I've used. 31 minutes and 2 seconds. I think the Anthropocene is a very interesting and very problematic concept. We were some of us who recently published an article about the anthropos in the Anthropocene, how the humans tend to be getting there are very many and very different, but they tend to get just one face in this Anthropocene. And I have a number of questions for you. For example, can Anthropocene be reverted? If we have moved into it, and maybe even the geologists have accepted it, if we are successful in moving back the kind of impacts we are doing that we don't like, should we then go back to Holocene? Is Anthropocene something to cherish or to question? Should we hail human progress making scars on the earth, or should we be discomforted by that? Should we like what we made to Earth or not? And if we like it, must we not especially like those who have been making the marks, the geoengineers, for example, the makers, the heroes of the Anthropocene? Shouldn't we create a new pantheon of the Anthropocene? And after all, why should we care so much about the earth? We used to think about agrarian societies, industrial societies, feudal societies, modern societies, societies that were taking on notions of human activities and things that were core to what humans did. But the Anthropocene seemed to be just one big hammer, and then the earth, and the interest is on the earth. Now why? Joe Masco again, Terraforming Planet Earth. It's a story of weapons of mass destruction. And he recently gave a seminar at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where we are together now. And it was a story about the impacts of the nuclear. And he also used a Japanese artist who had made this fantastic movie of all the bangs. He put all the bangs into a 10-minute show, and it was a massive experience to watch all that. You were even bored after 4 or 5 minutes. So many scars, so many things. And they aren't terribly amusing, I should say, after all. The scaling, important again, towards the planetary, how we have built this. This is really something for the humanists to take on, to write the story of how the planetary became so important. But what is the implications for power, for hegemony of knowledge, for technologies? Who is going to, so to speak, be the hegemonic interpreters of the realities of this particular epoch? And finally, is again this the oeuvre of humanity? If not, by whom? What is sustainable and unsustainable? We heard a question about that also before the pause. It is a blurring of the sustainable and the unsustainable. In the Anthropocene, everything is a mark on Earth, regardless whether it's good or bad, so to speak. And do we care whether it's good or bad? And again, the deceptive we are doing it. Humans are doing this and that. But I would like to question those words and ask us to be very, very careful when we use words like we and humans, because we are so different and we earn we have so much income differentials, so to speak. So question remains, what is after all the constructive use of this concept? Perhaps it provides a whole new scale on which to study culture and society. So it opens up a range of new opportunities for humanists and social sciences to contribute to this fantastic work done by the geoscientists and their community. And finally, I cannot avoid telling you that a good friend, an economist at Berkeley, Richard Norgard, once suggested, I think only a year ago or so, that a better term for the whole thing is econocene, because it is the economy that is making all these things on the earth. Ultimately, it's the economy, stupid. Thank you very much.